Welcome to Season 2 of One Orange Sock's podcast, Talking Sock. This season, I continue my talks with artists in Australia and overseas. To kick things off, I am joined by master marionettist Ronnie Burkett in this 2-hour international special.
Rehearsal begins at the drafting table for me. It's not when the puppet is finished at all.
It's so nice to be back here on Talking Sock. Welcome to Talking Sock, your place for puppetry arts and practitioners in Australia and now abroad. My name is Pete Davidson, and I would like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which I am coming to you from today, from Melbourne, which is Wurundjeri land. I would like to acknowledge Aboriginal people past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I would like to welcome to you our first episode of Season 2 with our guest who needs no introduction, coming to us all the way from Puppetland in Toronto, Canada. It's Ronnie Burkett. Ronnie, thank you so much for being on Talking Sock.
Pete, I'm your first abroad.
Bask
Thank
in
you.
that, the international glory.
Well, you know, I love your podcast so much, and you know my affinity with Australia. So every episode was interesting, or an old pal, or someone I'd met, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Oh, it's just such a pleasure, and I just want to say also on the record officially, your support throughout season 1, and that was when I was in, the midst of my lockdown here in Melbourne. Your audio sound bites and just the lovely support through your Instagram has been so lovely, and it's the best. So thank you for being here. This feels so fitting to have you as the first guest on the show.
Thank you.
Ronnie, first question. Why puppets, Ronnie?
For me personally, when I discovered puppets, it just made sense for a loner child who had all these split focus dreams of wanting to make stuff, wanting to tell stories, wanting to act, wanting to not be in this vessel that I'd been assigned at birth, And so I think when I saw a picture in the World Book Encyclopedia of Bill Baird and his wife surrounded by all these characters, animals, humans, fantastic creatures, I went, that's it for me, because that means I can do all of those things. I can draw, I can sculpt, I can make, I can tell stories, I can make funny voices. And when you're a loner child, I can do it by myself. So that was the initial impulse of why I loved puppetry and wanted to pursue it. And I've got to say, it's still true today, especially with the conversations we're having now that are overdue and necessary and hard, about visibility and inclusivity in the arts, and certainly in the theater. In a weird way, it allowed me to be gender fluid before we even had that term. I could be the fairy princess, the wicked witch, the three pigs, the big bad wolf, and the leading man. So for me, it has always been the most superior performing art form of them all, because it's not reliant on this, this shell that I'm stuck in this age and this gender and skin tone. Puppetry is limitless. So for me, that's why puppetry.
Far out. That is huge. Can I ask, how old were you when this kind of dropped?
I was 7 when that happened. My parents had bought a set of encyclopedia, and I was bothering my mother, and she said, go look at the books. And I grabbed a random volume. I sat on the floor, and it was the P volume, we now know. And I just grabbed it, opened it up, and it fell open to this 2-page spread on puppetry. And I looked at it, and my mother called me for lunch, and I said, oh, that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, and closed the book. The joke has always been in our family. It should have fallen open to plumber, podiatrist, a pediatrician, God, anything but puppetry. But no, it was puppetry. And I think that Christmas I got a silly little lion hand puppet in my Christmas stocking, which I took to school and coerced my teacher into letting me do a show with a couple other kids who got puppets. And it lasted probably 2 hours, and everyone else lost interest, and I just kept going.
Oh, God, I love that. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show and have you speak the way that you do. You were such a great storyteller. And last season, I ran an episode called Master and Apprentice with my puppet master, Catherine Hannaford. Ronnie, I would need to know, who was your master, who taught you puppetry? And if there was none, how did you find mastery yourself?
There were many. First port of call was the library. And because I think you might understand this, but I think it's more Canadian than an Australian thing. But because we're a far-flung colony, the library had British books and American books. And British and American puppetry styles are quite different, actually, certainly in the books. And so it was 50-50. So I had this equal influence of American puppetry and British puppetry coming at me through the library. And some of those books had addresses of puppet organizations in the back. And one had the Educational Puppetry Association in Britain, who I wrote, and Violet Philpott, who a legendary British puppeteer, wrote me back. And I wrote her back, and she wrote me back. So we had an exchange. And years later, when I was playing at the Burkett in London, Violet came to my show, and I can't tell you how thrilling that was for me. She didn't remember writing those letters because she wrote so many of those letters to young puppet enthusiasts, but she became a very, very dear friend to me, and I'm glad I got to know her personally. It also had the Puppeteers of America, and I wrote them. And, you know, I'm very, you're not going to believe this. I'm actually shy and I'm a bit of a hermit, but I'm ballsy when I want something. So I wrote the Puppeteers of America and said, how may I join your organization? I have no money. I'm a child. And the secretary of the Puppeteers of America wrote back and said, we're giving you a junior membership for free for 1 year. Oh. And so I got the Puppetry Journal, and in the Puppetry Journal was an ad for the Stevens Correspondence Course in Puppetry, 20 sessions for $30. You got a session mailed to you every week, and it was written by Martin Stevens. And I took that when I was 12 years old, I think.
Goodness.
And it went through voice work, script work, publicizing your show, how to carve a counterbalance marionette, hand puppets, puppet stages, casting. And the last session, the deal was you would write your questions to Martin Stevens and he would write session 20 for you. I just never let session 20 end. So he was stuck with me. And at some point in my teens, I announced that I was free to come visit over the Easter holidays and pick me up at the Elkhart airport, won't you? Because my parents were insane. They would put this child on airplanes to cross the border and go stay with people that they had never met. So, which I don't think would happen now. No, but off I went, you know, and I would write people, you know, Noreen Young was a huge, so Martin Stevens was my key mentor, the great mentor of my life. And I will say that everything in the Stevens Correspondence Course of Puppetry is still the foundation of everything for me, writing and voice work and all of that stuff. I mean, I've certainly expanded on it and had more training with other people in various aspects, but it still pretty much holds true as the basis of everything I do. When I was 10 years old, I wrote Noreen Young, who was a legendary Canadian television puppeteer, and she had a show called High Diddle Day, and I wrote her a fan letter, but it was mostly, how do you make those rubber puppets? And Lord help her, she sat down and wrote a 4-page handwritten letter to a child explaining her technique, where to buy the rubber. Here's the address of the company in Quebec that sells the rubber. And she told me her whole technique in a 4-page letter. Boom. And she's been stuck with me ever since. So I met her when I was 10. So I've known Noreen over 50 years. And, you know, we're still in contact and we love each other dearly. But I wrote a lot of fan letters, Pete, and God forbid any of them wrote me back, because I took it as friends for life and I'm going to bombard you with questions and eventually invite myself to come stay with you for 2 weeks. So
I feel like maybe the podcast is the modern letter, but anyway,
yeah, I mean, I didn't have this kind of connectivity. You know, I didn't have social media. I mean, I know young puppeteers who met from their YouTube pages when they were teenagers, and they're best friends to this day. And they talk to each other every night by video call or whatever way they're communicating. I didn't have that. I had to mail a letter, wait for it to come back. And in the 6 weeks or the 2 months waiting for a reply, I would just go build more puppets and take more photographs and get the photographs developed and send them those pictures, So it was it was a much slower process than it would be today.
But it's funny because, we've got online courses like what Bernda Grognik's doing, in Iceland, and it's a correspondence course, like you mentioned, but it's just digital. But for me, the fact that something like that existed and it was a mail out, I wish, where are those lessons? I want to read them. I want to see them.
Well, Lumen Code in British Columbia, who has Charlemagne Press, which publishes only puppet books, he reprinted it as one volume. So you can... Where is it? It must be right behind me.
Ronnie's looking at his enormous bookshelf.
There we go.
Oh my gosh,
there's the reprint.
There it is.
And it's even got some of the sample session 20s that he wrote for various people, including mine, in here. So this is available, actually.
I'm geeking out. As an extension, Ronnie, to why puppets, why marionettes specifically?
Well, Pete, I started off with hand puppets, schlepped hand puppet shows around. And then, of course, mostly marionettes from the get-go, because my first real exposure to puppetry was Bill Baird in the World Book Encyclopedia. And that same year at Christmas, The Sound of Music came out, and there was the Lonely Goat Herd scene.
There was.
So thus began my lifelong obsession with Bill Baird. So I wrote him when I was 7 or 10, maybe. No, 7. I think I was 7 because I found his address in some children's magazine that they had at school and was talking about him. And so I wrote him and said, I would like to come live with you. And he never wrote back. So when I was 10, I wrote him again and said, no, seriously, I'm prepared to leave my family and move to New York and live with you. Didn't hear from him. At 14, I was getting a little frustrated. So I wrote him again and said, listen, seriously, I'm dying. I'm dying in school. You've got to save me. I will come to New York, adopt me, whatever. Didn't hear from him. Wrote him in university when I was about to leave the theater school I was in. And I quoted the last paragraph of his book, The Art of the Puppet, where he said, it's our duty to train young puppeteers and pass this along. So I quoted that in a letter. I said, I am dying in theater school. You owe it to me. I'm the next one. Would you please hire me? Didn't hear back from him. So I'm going to veer off here. This is such a good story. So I quit theater school, saved up a bunch of money because I heard there was an UNIMA Congress in Moscow. I believe it was 1976. And there was a tour group being put together of American puppeteers. And so I got a job for 4 months, saved up all the money I needed, got all the visa stuff to go to Russia. And at the age of 18, I went to Moscow. Now, I'd forgotten this part of this story until last week. I was telling someone, and they were like, are you kidding? That was one trip. So I had to fly from where I lived in Western Canada eastward and meet the group, I think, in New York. But I managed to book my flight so I could stop in Ottawa for 3 days because I invited myself to go stay with Noreen Young, my hero from television puppetry. Mm-hmm. So I just landed. And spent 3 days. Then we went to Moscow and I met Bill Baird and he said, I remember your letters. I could never find your address. And anyway, are you going to be in New York anytime? You should come audition. And I said, well, after this, we go to New York for 2 days. I'll be there. He said, okay, come and audition. So that was Moscow. Saw the most amazing puppetry I've ever seen in my life. Blew my head off because it was the Obraztsov Theater, it was the state theater.
I do.
Then after that, we went and we'd gone to Poland and saw Polish puppetry. And then we went to England, but I had wrangled an invitation to leave the group for a day and go to Elstree Studios as a guest of Jim Hansen to watch the Muppet Show being shot. Because I'd found my little thing to present at security saying Mr. Hansen has invited Ronnie Burkett. So that's what, so I did that. And then we flew to New York. And on my 19th birthday, I auditioned for Bill Baird and he hired me. So I hit all of those puppet stops on one trip. And that was Pete, that was my master's degree. That was my undergraduate and my master's degree in puppetry. So I don't know. So Bill Baird, what I guess was a mentor in a way. Noreen Young certainly was. The books were writing letters, just constantly. I had this sense that people knew something I needed to get to the next step. And they had to answer my question about mold making or foam rubber or latex or marionette control, whatever. They just had to. They couldn't resist me because I was like, I'm the next one. Give it to me, please. Not that I was the next one. I was one of the next ones. But
yeah, it strikes me because it's regardless of, however many years ago it was, or it is still that same thing with puppeteers and the generosity of that spirit of giving knowledge and passing knowledge. It's a through line that I have found throughout this entire journey of learning about puppetry and learning about people's experiences of trying to get the training that they desire. And, that to me just speaks to the community that we have, I think.
I would like to be on the record of saying I don't know of another human being who's been the recipient of more kindness and generosity of spirit than me, from really great artists and from a community. But I find that the greatest artists are the most generous. A technique isn't something to be competitive or secretive about. It's what you do with that technique that makes you an artist and gives you a point of view. So that's far and wide in puppetry now, that sharing of information, like you mentioned.
Now, obviously, we're coming to you from Puppetland, and so you are surrounded by 1,300 books. It is, and there's 1,600 books. I stand corrected. So, tell us about Puppetland. This magical place all of us baby puppeteers want to run away to. And how long have you had it? And what's your setup? And
I think I've been here 12 years. I had a much larger studio before I came here in a huge warehouse building that I think was 1,400 square feet with 14-foot ceilings. And is fairly large. But the way of all cities, that building had been a square city block of artist studios, and the third floor of that building was all pornography studios. So, it was an inner city dump warehouse building. And of course, now it has lawyers' offices and fancy restaurants, and there's condo towers all around it. So So I downsized a little bit. I'd been looking for a place to live and work for 8 years, I think, because all I do is tour, and then I'm in the studio when I'm home. So I was losing like my best hours of the day getting to a studio on public transit and then getting home at 11 o'clock at night on an hour on streetcars and stuff. So this place is a storefront. I think it used to be a diner in its original incarnation. It was a nail salon when I found it, but it has the original terrazzo floors, the original pressed tin ceiling, 12-foot ceilings, and the apartment is right upstairs. And I can access it from within the building without even leaving. So it's such a beautiful room. And why it works for me, Pete, is it's not overly large, but we can get 6 people in here working if we have a deadline, and it's very happy and comfortable. But it's also completely comfortable to walk down in the middle of the night in the dark and be here by myself. It's not so overwhelmingly large. And in the back is a tiny little wood shop, which is sort of Ronnie's man cave, where I spend most of my time, So yeah, it's a lovely little building. We have a courtyard that we built, and there's been many puppeteer dinners out there well into the evening. It just feels right here. It's good.
I'm interested. So what is a day in the studio look like to you? Like when do you start? What do you get into? Are you just tinkering in the back? Or
are we talking pre-COVID or currently?
Whichever answer you want to give me, I'll accept.
Well, I'm highly disciplined. So pre-COVID, I would rarely wander down here in my pajamas. I made a rule that this is my workspace and come to work, Ronnie, just as you would go anywhere else. And I typically was getting up at 5:30 in the morning, and I'd be down here by 6:30 ready to go. And if someone was coming to work, and a lot of times I would have an apprentice or an assistant working in the studio who would show up usually 10 o'clock in the morning, say. So I would get at least 3 hours to myself to daydream, get going, lay out their work, get my work set up. And depending what was going on, it would either be sculpting, or it'd be a drafting day, or it'd be a carving day. Since COVID, every day has been kind of like Sunday in here. So Sunday was Trust me, Pete, if I'm not on the road, I'm in this room every day, even if I'm not working on something, because I have a whole floor. I have a whole floor of a building to myself. So why wouldn't I come down here?
Yeah.
And on Sundays, I just would not turn on the overhead lights. I might have a work lamp on or daylight or whatever. And Sundays, I usually just sit and daydream. I won't lie. I'll just daydream or think of something and get a book off the shelf and stare at it. But it was kind of my daydream day. So COVID has been kind of a lot of Sundays in this room, to tell you the truth. But I'm gearing up to do a whole bunch of new work now. So I feel that I'm getting back on that track of getting up in the morning, being ready, being dressed, coming down and greeting the day in this room while I still have it, So
I'm interested because it's April 9 here, April 8 in Canada, and your city, Toronto, has just gone back into lockdown. And I want to know, our international community of people want to know what is the future of theatre in Toronto, do you think? And how do you feel like your city will recover from all this?
I'm worried. I will say I was one of a little pack of renegades over the last 20 years or so of dealing with actors' equity who don't understand artist created work. To the point of I have to sign a contract with myself as the producer and as the performer and sign both lines and promise that I won't renege on paying me. And it got a little ridiculous of self-producing your own work and creating. And so we've been trying to educate actors' equity about that. And it's a growing trend, I think, in every country of artist created work. Well, what has happened by proxy of COVID is the theater has kind of shuttered and crumbled. We don't know who's going to survive, truly, what companies will survive. I think, for the most part, I try and think, well, here we go. We're just going to reinvent the theater finally. We're going to make it anew. I don't think theaters are going to open in Canada before spring of 2022. So I've got another full year before I have a booking for May of 2022, but it's in Germany. So that's all I got on the table. But I do think artists have to be nimble right now. And I see it in our community. There's been a lot of online stuff. That's not something I naturally am drawn to and not something I want to do. So I've got other plans in mind of how to do this, but it is without a doubt devastating to the global theater community. It's devastating. And, what always happens too, because we have film and TV production going on here. We're solid with film and TV production.
Yeah.
And we've lost a lot of great theater people who need by just paying their rent and getting groceries. They've gone into the film world, great scenic designers who are now, dressers or great costume builders who are getting paid insane money to work in film and television. And I wonder if we'll get them back at the theater once they've been paid that kind of film and TV money. So it'll be very interesting to see how we reemerge. And the biggest thing too, Pete, is when will the audience feel comfortable enough to reassemble in those rooms with us?
Oh, that's a big one. Just on this end, though, we've just had the Melbourne International Comedy Festival here in Melbourne, and we've been out of lockdown now for possibly just touching on 6 months, and Melbourne's back. So I don't think it will take too long. It is obviously everything's COVID safe. Everything's very different. COVID is constantly, by every single QR code you snap on, it is a constant reminder. But I feel like people are so desperate to be out and to see, theatre again. I feel like audiences bounce back quite quickly.
Well, I do agree with you on that. That's the most salient point, I think, of this whole discussion, is that because of isolation, people are going to be, I know people already are. I have audience members that I'm in touch with who are yearning to go sit in the theater and be told an acoustic story again. They're yearning for it. And so I think while we will see more digital creation and more digital product from artists as an ongoing thing, more online learning, a lot of stuff will continue. Working from home will allow more flexibility. But I think the theater is going to be just fine. I do, because it is that one primal sit in the dark and be told a story experience that you have to be in the room to get.
It's great because you're in Puppetland and you've got these 1,600 books behind you, but like you've been in lockdown for quite a while now, and you've been using Instagram to kind of post archival content, vaudeville acts and vintage puppetry. And I see this deep respect for those who've come before you, and I can see you kind of actively reflecting and daydreaming about these different people. So who are these people? And is this an intentional thing that you're doing by posting out the old masters and sort of giving sort of an education to our young puppeteers who are following you? Is that a very intentional act?
Totally intentional. And that came about, the first year I was a guest artist at the O'Neill Puppetry Conference at the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center. My first group, the first year I was there, coerced me to sign up for Facebook because they wanted to keep in touch with me.
Funny.
And so I got onto Facebook, and I very quickly realized that a lot of younger puppeteers, and this is not me being shady or slagging anything, did not know anything about puppetry pre-Jim Henson. That just is a kind of huge fact in our world right now. And I thought, well, I have a lot of this knowledge. I'm not an academic. I'm not a historian, but I know pretty much everything in those books, and I know my influences. So wouldn't it be interesting to show some of that stuff? And I worked a lot on albums of certain puppeteers for Facebook. And, I haven't been on Facebook for maybe over 3 years now, but Instagram, I came up with this naff idea to do a thing called Puppet Tuesday, which is just images from puppetry that inspire me. And so, it is very intentional as a way of saying, did you know about this amazing artist who did this thing? And these Russian puppet films from the 1950s that had live hands, because Hansen didn't invent live hands on puppets. Without being shady, just going, look, this was in the 50s in Russia. Look what they were doing. So I think that goes over fairly well. People seem to like it.
Well, people love the bedtime stories. So the bedtime stories, I think, are like the reason I go to Instagram on a Tuesday. I have to say, I see a show emerging from the bedtime stories series of work that you've been doing. It's been so wonderful. Tell us about the bedtime stories and how you've sort of cultivated a little community of people to come and listen to you speak, every week.
Well, bedtime stories happened in really, really early on in the first lockdown a year ago, when I really was trying to be a cheerleader of saying, you know what, we're going to get through this. And, I was one of those people in the first few weeks posting things saying, well, you're at home, you're not going anywhere. This would be a great time to sit down and learn to sculpt or learn to, there's been a lot of backlash, not with me personally, over the year of therapists saying you can forgive yourself. You don't have to write King Lear this year. You don't have to make the great puppet show at the, so, and I get that now, but I didn't know this was going to last this long. And so I remember the first one I did, I think was just saying, hey, and I think it was in the first week, Pete, of just saying, the World Encyclopedia of Puppetry Arts is online. So you know what? You can access all this information from Unima online about the history of puppetry in any country. And it's in pretty much any language too. Yeah. So it's available. And then I told a story about Egon Schiele, one of my favorite artists, who was a protege of Gustav Klimt in Vienna, and how that he died in his 20s from the Spanish flu plague, and his pregnant wife had died just prior to him. And so I was saying, we've got to take this seriously. And so that was a little story. But then I just sort of turned the camera on myself one night, and I think I told some naff story about some nonsense I'd done on the road or somebody I'd met or some funny, stupid story. And that's how that started. And, those first 3 months in lockdown got to be a bit stir crazy. I'm not used to being home this often or this long, unless I'm building a show. So I would paddle down here at night after dinner, and I didn't even have like a little tripod. I didn't have a ring light. I had nothing. I would just hold the phone in front of my face and tell these, 12-minute stories that weren't rehearsed or scripted. It was just bedtime stories from Puppetland. Yeah.
we've just been talking about theatre and how it's coming, how it might come back. How do you think your shows, because you do tour so much, how do you feel like your show will come back, and how will Puppetland be a part of that?
Well, it's interesting because the two shows you've seen, Pete, the Daisy Theater and Forget Me Not, are the Daisy Theater has a bit of audience participation. I call people up from the audience. They come up on the bridge, they lie down on the floor, they take off their shirts, whatever they need to do in that bit of nonsense. But Forget Me Not is completely immersive. It's saying to 100 people a night, here's a hand puppet. Stick your hand in this hand puppet that somebody else had their hand in last night. And I'm going to sweat very close to you, and you're going to move around, and you're going to touch flashlights, and you're going to touch each other. And I might hug you at some point. Well, I have two very audience hands-on pieces right now that I don't know if I'm going to be doing those soon. Yeah. So my thought over the last year was, I need to create some new work that's not reliant on the audience that way, because that's where my work was intentionally going. This mad love affair with the audience. I wanted to be closer to them, and I wanted to involve them. And now I think I have to pull back a little bit from the audience for a little while. So I'm making new work, and I'm making new work not knowing what I hate this word, what the marketplace will be. So I'm making a salon hand puppet show that would be for, 12 people a night. It could either be in my studio, or I could take it to your living room, or I could do it in your garage, or I could do it in a church hall. And you know what? That's how I started in puppetry. And I have no ego about that. And some of my favorite puppeteers work that way. They schlep their hand puppet stage around, and they set it up themselves, and they do the show, and they carry on. And I did that for years. So I know how to do that. So I'm excited to make a silly little improvised hand puppet show called The Looney Bin. And then I'm going to make, on Blind Faith, I'm going to make a typical Ronnie marionette show, like the old scripted shows, called Wonderful Joe, about a man and his dog who are going to be separated to take off on a fantastic adventure. It's not a pandemic piece, because I pray to God we don't see a bunch of solo shows about pandemic life, because we all have lived it. We don't need it. But a global audience will understand what isolation feels like now. So the premise of Wonderful Joe is the thought of being isolated and detached, these two characters. So, the old man's supposed to go to a nursing home, and the dog's going to be sent off to be euthanized. And so they make a break for it. Gosh, and they have this adventure, Amazing. And it kills me. I love this show so much. And it's very funny in spots too, very, very funny. There's a bar where Santa Claus and Jesus Christ meet Mother Nature for cocktails, so, it's still silly. The third show is the Daisy Theater is going to do Shakespeare, because I had done Christmas Carol with the Daisy Theater called Little Dickens. And so it was the Daisy Theater cast improvising through Christmas Carol. And Esme Mazengill, the has-been fated star, was Scrooge, and Schnitzel was Tiny Tim. And that thing's going to be booked every Christmas for the rest of my life. So I thought I really wanted to do a Shakespeare, and a lot of wise people that I trust and admire had said to me, Ronnie, you don't need to do Hamlet. You don't need to do a serious thing, because your own work is your serious work. So here you have this golden thing called the Daisy Theater that will play forever and ever and ever. And I thought that through, and I went, yes, you know what? There's nothing more beautiful than seeing characters who shouldn't be playing that role cast in that role. And so we're going to tackle Romeo and Juliet, because most people studied that at some point in school. And even if you didn't, the premise: two teenagers, totally warring households, can't get together, fall in love, they die. Like, everybody knows that. It's like Christmas Carol. Everybody knows three ghosts, redemption, boom. So it's still a good Saturday night show. No one's going to feel like, I don't know Shakespeare, I can't go, because it'll be, Esme Mazengill playing the nurse or whatever. So, and I'm always cursed, Pete, when I come up with a really good title. And so the title of the Daisy Theater Shakespeare show is called Little Willie. Once I saw that, I saw the front curtain, I went, there, I'm on board.
Not the innuendo.
And the other show I'm doing is for two people at a time.
That's 4 shows, Ronnie. That's 4 shows
over 3 years. Over 3 years. So that's the plan. The hand puppet show will come first, but the show for two people at a time will take all 3 years to build because I need 500 puppet heads for it. So I'll be
okay.
So you'll come into a little gallery or you'll come into a little Airstream trailer. It'll be a late night thing or a sideshow thing. It's called sideshow hand job is what it's called. You'll come in 2 at a time and you'll get 5 minutes or maybe 10, I don't know, to look at the 500 heads on the wall and pick 2 each. And you come and I'm sitting at a card table and you put them down and I make up a 20-minute story with those 4 characters on my bare hands.
Now, this is something that you do. And I've asked this question of you before, but I have to ask it again. And that is, Daisy Theatre was 40 odd puppets and you could put any 2 of them together and any audience member with those puppets and you would have an improvised scene complete with backstory and song and different ideas about how the 2 characters interrelate and their relationship. And then you're talking about now expanding that to 500 individual heads that you're going to have puppet backstory. How do you have that repository in your brain of how these characters can do all these different things? That's what gets me.
Because I view any part of the process as rehearsal. Let me explain. Well, if I'm at the drafting table drawing a marionette thing, front and side, full view to make patterns, basically, I'm acting that. I'm like, I have to stand up. Is he hunched over? Like, how does Wonderful Joe stand? And what's that doing to his breathing apparatus? Is he like one of these guys? Or is he one of these guys? And then I'm posturing and I'm drawing. So unbeknownst to me, I'm already deciding rehearsal stuff. And then when I sculpt the head, I've had this rule for years when I'm sculpting, no matter how beautiful this little sculpture may be, if I can't give it voice while I'm sculpting it, it's not the right sculpt. Smash it and start over until you can make a voice out loud. Wow. When I'm writing text work, I have an advantage over any playwright friend I know. I write aloud. I write in character voice aloud as I'm writing. I'm setting the rhythm and I'm making myself laugh or cry. You get to cry once when you're writing, so I get it out if I've written something moving. When I'm carving and jointing, especially jointing, I'm in rehearsal. Is this character going to sit? Do its hips need to do this? Does the arm need to cross the body? Do I have to put that joint in the upper arm so it can cross over to? So, and then, costume. I'm a costume freak, as you know, and just spending hours and hours of dyeing fabric and beating it down and washing it until it's the right scale and it looks the right thing. So Pete, every step of the process for me is getting to know that character. So by the time the puppet's finished, I already know the voice. I've already made all the choices of why it moves that way, why it's dressed that way. And so rehearsal begins at the drafting table for me. It's not when the puppet is finished at all.
That's wild.
I had an interaction with a young puppeteer a few days ago. I think he got a bit cranky with me because, he had a night off and he was all set to do puppet building. He was all set and his gang of friends that he video chats with all bailed on him. And he was really upset because he was really wanting to go build puppets that night. I went, well, pardon my language, but I said, when did puppetry become a circle jerk? I mean, it's a lonely profession. And I said, frankly, you should be doing this on your own. So you're honestly engaged with the thing that's emerging and you're giving it a voice. You don't need a committee. It's not a quilting circle where you're just absent-mindedly. Maybe if you're doing the Hansen stitch on 800 pieces of fabric, yes, have a video chat and do that. That's a different thing. But if you're creating a character and sitting down to do that, why would you want to be talking to anyone else? So for me, I think I've added this level of character emergence, if you will, just because it is a very lonely life and these things take forever to build. When I'm building a show, I work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week in this studio. It's relentless. It's relentless. So I at least have to have a conversation with those characters as it's happening.
Just to follow up on that, you mentioned the costumes. Do you create individual costumes for every character? Is that you who also does that level of because they're so beautiful, the costumes as well?
I design everything, but I've worked with the same costumer for over 30 years. Her name's Kim Crosley. And She is a cutter at the Stratford Festival. So she's a real theater costumer. That's how I met her. But Kim has done every costume for me for over 30 years. And so we have a kind of shorthand. And a lot of times I don't even like if I'm pushed for time or really lazy, I don't even have to do a drawing. We just put the puppet on her work table, hang it up, and a lot of times she'll come in and I pin the costume together, like with the fabric, like this kind of vibe like that. But because I'm so particular, every character's costume, like I've got stuff for the new shows just over here in a basket. Every piece of fabric for every character is in its own Ziploc big bag, all the trim, all the buttons. If it needed to be washed or dyed, it was washed or dyed. So it's all ready to go. So there's no sort of in the moment going, oh, if only I had a blue feather, and then spending 2 hours looking for a blue feather. You know, that's all decided before Kim gets here. So.
Wow. Let's talk about those two shows that I have seen, Daisy Theatre and Forget Me Not. And, you know, we've already spoken so much about Forget Me Not here on this show with other guests because it was, particularly for Australian audiences, profound because you're inviting the audience to come in and play with puppets. And for adults, I feel like that is both a terrifying and absolutely freeing experience. And, you kind of punch-drunked puppetry there, dude. Like you made this immersive piece of theatre. And I looked up and I saw all these pieces of paper suspended from the ceiling. And I later met you in the show and you told me that that was the script. Now, I'm 30 and relative to you, I only started with puppets 5 years ago. So I'm arriving a little late to the party and I've never written my own show. And I've got to write two little ones in the next few months. So this is very selfish, but the level of nuance that you bring to your shows, it would be stupid not to ask you how you approach writing a show like the Daisy Theatre or Forget Me Not. And, you know, how do you get yourself into a space to manifest a story and realize that into a whole show?
Writing is the hardest thing to do. And I think any writer will tell you that. I could, I'm very disciplined, Pete. I'm we've talked about, I come down here, I do the work. If there's 40 puppets, that's 80 legs that got to be carved. So I carve 80 legs, that I can do even when I'm brain dead. But, I can make every excuse on the planet not to sit down and write. I famously, every summer when I was writing a new big piece, it'd be like, this is my 2-week writing spree. I will not cook. I am in process. And then I would just sit and stare at the thesaurus or my screen or go for a walk, anything. It's hard. So, with Forget Me Not, I was writing everything on my laptop and it just wasn't coming. It wasn't the show I wanted. And because, as you know, the show is about love letters and cursive writing and this one person who does it and can read it. One day I realized I had to change the mechanics of what I was doing. I couldn't write on my laptop. So all 182 of those handwritten pages that float above you in the actual show was me sitting down with a pen and a pad of yellow foolscap going, start. And you have to cross it out. You can't be precious. You can't use a thesaurus or a dictionary. You do not stop for anything. You just write in longhand cursive, no looking up anything. Go. And it flew out of me. It was fantastic. Now, I've always, for the last 20 years, had a dramaturg. I worked with a woman named Iris Turcotte, who became probably one of my greatest friends of my life. And she passed away 3 years ago. But she believed there was no methodology to dramaturgy, that every new project needed its vocabulary invented for that project. And even though she worked with a stable of the same Canadian playwrights over years, she never said, this is how I work with Ronnie. She would say, what does Ronnie need for this vocabulary? So, for example, she would, on one show, I was blocked. And I said, she's like, you should write this scene. I'm like, I don't want to write that scene. And she said, you should write that scene. I don't want to write that scene. I'm feeling romantic. I want to write all this stuff. She went, you've written all that garbage already. We're going to throw it all out. So you should write this scene. And I was being really resistant. And I sat down and wrote that scene. And of course, it was the missing link that I needed. And the next show, she yelled at me. She said, stop writing. You've got to stop writing for 6 weeks. I said, why? I'm on a roll. She said, you're on a terrible roll. What you need to do is stop for 6 weeks, sculpt all the character heads so you can see them while you're writing. You're not seeing them. You're not making the voices. She said, you're not writing aloud because you haven't sculpted the damn heads yet. And she knows my process. So I spent 6 weeks sculpting, and with my rule of I have to make the voice. And I went back to writing 6 weeks later, fully able to converse out loud with myself and write it down. Another show, she told me to stop writing because I wasn't envisioning the traffic pattern or what the environment was. She said, do the set models. So I took a month off, made 12 really bad set models until I found the one I wanted. And then there was the set model sitting on the work table in front of me while I wrote the script. So everything needs, especially with puppetry, Pete, I really think that we separate things too much. It's like I was talking about the building process and finding character. I know the character by the time the puppet's finished. So I think we have to imbue puppet production with the same thing of, if you're stuck writing the thing, what are you missing? That's another important element of puppetry. Do you need the puppet? Do you need to experiment with what the puppet does before you write the thing? Do you want to make the puppet smaller because you want to make it a more intimate thing? But I think we don't pose those questions of puppetry is all of these aspects that become the performance, which is all the audience cares about, you know. But writing is really hard. But for me, the number one thing I do, honest to goodness, is usually in hotel rooms on tour. I do a year of really bad writing. I call it doodle writing, but I improv out loud. I'm sure if people are in the room next to me at 3 a.m, they hear these mad dramatic conversations with all these people going on. And it's just one guy in there walking around in his underwear going, but Cecily, I told you you mustn't go. I have to go, you know, or whatever I'm doing in there. And it's quite ridiculous. But once in a while, I'll get a little riff or a line or a little scene, and then I'll go write it down and not think about it, you know. And then, you know, because it's doodle writing, you look at it after a year and go, oh, garbage. Oh, that's good. That's good. That's garbage. What was I drinking that night? But I fully encourage puppeteers who are writing, stand up, walk around and talk out loud, improv. You know what you want to write. Don't stress about sitting down and having to write it. You know, that's crazy stressful for a lot of people. But if you get up and just start having fun, that's what, you know, I have to always remind myself, Pete, I got into this because it looked like it was going to be fun. And if anyone can kill the fun out of puppetry, it's me. It's like deadline, perfection, no sleep. When in fact, gosh darn it, I'm a puppeteer. I grew up to be who I wanted to be. It should be fun all the time, right? So stand up and talk out loud.
I want to know how that process has changed for you, but I like, you know, how the process of writing has changed for you since the early days, but also how's your relationship with the audience changed? And because, you know, we mentioned earlier how it will change. It has to change because of COVID, but it came from such an intimate place before that. And then before that, you know, it was a step back. So there's definitely been this relationship with the audience that has informed how you write. So how has that changed over the years?
I would say in the past 5 or 7 years, pre-COVID, so, you know, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I had this revelation. I was backstage one night peeking. I was doing my ritual. I have this big ritual I do backstage every night. Peeking. I'm a peeker. I have to have the crew has to set up the curtains in a way that there's a spot where I can peek and look at the audience. You know, I want to smell them. And I was terrified. It was a Saturday night. And sometimes Saturday nights are the worst night in the theater because of dynamic pricing. They've paid more and they've probably gone out for dinner because it was their weekend. And the husbands don't want to be there and their bellies are full of steak and wine. And they just don't want to see a damn puppet show. Let's be honest. And so it was a Saturday and I was nervous and it was full. It was packed and they were boisterous. And I had this moment, Pete, of thinking, Ronnie, these people have spent $70 per ticket to see a puppet show. They've paid for parking and dinner. This is a big deal to them. None of these people have dressed up and gone out tonight hoping you fail.
Oh,
these people want this to work more than anything in the world right now for the next 2 hours. And these people for the next 2 hours, Ronnie, are your best friends on the planet. And that changed everything for me. I never viewed the audience as something to be corralled or at war with or disappointed in. It's like, who showed up tonight? And it changed going to the theater every day since. It's like, yay, who's showing up tonight? Because it's always different. There's always a different dynamic, and audiences don't know that. Audiences don't know that. I don't even know what it is, but something in the room goes, we're this way tonight. And that's pretty exciting. I get to go on a date for 2 hours, and invariably, I fall in love for 2 hours. I'm smart enough and old enough to know that, they're not going to be waiting at the stage door with flowers and winking at me, thank God. But I get to fall in love for 2 hours every night and then send them on their way. And so the audience is central to me in the work right now, central. And I do consider them to a point, but at a certain point, Pete, you still have to just make your work, But as I said earlier, what's been on my brain lately is it's rare that the entire planet, everyone on the planet knows the same experience. Everybody will know what 2020 was, and they will have their own story of it. So I'm getting very emotional. Oh. This saves me so much work because I don't have to tell anybody what feeling isolated and alone is like. I just need to create that sense with a character. I don't need to tell you what being in love is like, what being rejected in love is like, what loss is like, what absolute mirthful giggling is like. We all have these things in our frame of reference. And so I've learned over the years, I don't have to be that sassy 26-year-old that I was standing on a soapbox telling you because I'd figured it all out. I can just let characters have their experience in whatever the story is. And hopefully the audience then can do the most beautiful thing of saying, I don't know that particular incident, but I know that feeling. And when the audience connects with a character through feeling, it is the great aha. It's when the breath happens in theater. And that's what I've really learned. It's impossible for me to teach this to young artists because I was a young artist, and you must, as a rule, as a young artist, be so full of your fucking self that you have to tell us everything all the time. Because I certainly had to, But audiences are so smart. They know all those emotional touchstones. So just let the character have them. Let the character have their thing or their interactions, and it'll all work out. I believe that.
You are listening to Talking Sock with One Orange Sock and Ronnie Burkett. We will be right back after the break. Make sure you hit subscribe and follow One Orange Sock Productions on Instagram. More with Ronnie in just a minute. Want to start a conversation at your next gig or festival? Then grab your wallets because we've got merch. Head to our Redbubble store to get your hands on some signature One Orange Sock designs. We believe that podcasts should be advert-free. So if you like what you're listening to, there's a new way to help support our podcast. No monthly subscriptions, just a simple tip to share your kindness and to help us get by. Follow the link in the podcast notes or at oneorangesock.com to buy us a coffee. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening to Talking Sock. Welcome back. You are listening to Talking Sock with me, Pete Davidson, and Ronnie Burkett. Ronnie, controversial topic to kick us off in this half.
Okay.
Let's preface that we love Jim Henson, we love Muppets, we do, but
of course
we do. We know, and we have deep respect. But there is a question, Ronnie, that as a marionettist I need to ask of you, because you're working in North America. And there's this thing about sort of the ubiquity of the Muppet. I want to know if this is a thing and if there is a problem with that, with the prevalence of television and live Muppetry and Western puppetry arts. And I guess the question I want to ask you is, do we need to strike more of a balance so that other forms of puppetry can exist and thrive in that space? Or do you feel like there is no problem and, marionettes have, and hand puppets and glove, they all have their own spaces and they occupy those spaces? Is there a problem?
Oh my goodness. This is such a huge conversation, and I do want to preface it on the back of what you said. Jim Henson changed the landscape of our craft. He made it so populist and so popular, and was a fantastic innovator and artist. So I just have to put that on the table. The other thing is, does anyone really care for my opinion either way? I'm an observer. I've been in this game for a long time, and I think about puppetry actively every day, my entire life, and I've read about it. And two things. One, Pete, I watched the Muppet explosion emerge. I, as a child, watched the Ed Sullivan Show with those great sketches that Jim and gang were doing. And the early specials, the Frog Prince and the Great Santa Claus Switch, or whatever it was called, were shot in Canada. So they were on the CBC. And that was very exciting. And so I watched this happened. And when I was in New York working for Bill Baird, it was on the cusp of the Muppet Show explosion. And it did explode. I saw our entire craft just go, this is puppetry now, and I was fortunate. Right after Bill Baird, I got to go work with Bonnie Erickson, who designed and built Miss Piggy and Statler and Waldorf. I worked in Bonnie's shop. Bonnie, to this day, is a dear friend of mine that I speak to regularly. I was as influenced by that explosion as any puppeteer. And because I worked with Bonnie when I came back to Canada, I had those skills. I knew how to carve foam. I knew how to flock foam. I knew how to flat pattern. I'd learned from the master just by watching her in the short time I worked with her. But I had it. Most people don't know this about me, Pete. I had my focus in the 80s was television puppetry. I did industrials, commercials, TV series. And for 5 years of my life, I would go to Montreal for 5 months every year and do television series with puppets that were made by Jean-Guy White, who had worked at Hansen. Wow. So I was doing Muppet style puppetry for years. That was what I thought my career might be in tandem to the marionette shows. So I certainly cannot be critical of that in any way, because I was part and parcel of that explosion and one of the ones who wanted to be part of that industry. When you think about it, Jim Henson invented a form of puppetry that was strictly for the camera.
Yeah. And
I love that, I think, all that aside, so that's my disclaimer that I was as influenced as anyone, and I could show you reams of photographs for years of television puppets I made, be they foam or be they latex rubber, like Noreen Young, who influenced me when I was 10 years old. I did a lot of hand in mouth and rod puppetry for the bulk of my career. At one point, my studio had 400 foam puppets in it. And I think when I moved from the West to Toronto, I actually threw them all away. So I don't have any, and foam deteriorates, it's a disposable material for a disposable industry, right? So it's just like shoot it, capture it, and it's done. And I loved that. But what I do notice now, Peter, I'll get serious now. Peter. It seems to be that people are just recreating the same thing over and over and over, when there are actually artists in the world who are using fabric and foam in the hand and rod style to create different looks. And I think North America in particular is trapped in Cloneville. And more than that, and you know what, Pete, honestly, I get it. I get being young, and I didn't have the experience of Bill Baird's work or Noreen Young's work when I was at Nascent Puppeteer, of having bed sheets and toothbrushes and stuffed toys of their characters. So I didn't grow up surrounded by this imagery that I love. And we all love aspects of our childhood that saved us.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of people who love the Muppets, civilians or in our craft, who grew up inundated with that licensing and merchandising and the ability to own a Burt doll or an Elmo, of course, there's a deep-seated love for those characters by young puppeteers who got into puppetry because of that work. So to reference back to something I said in the first half, I post pictures of historic puppetry or other puppetry. More and more, I'm posting work of contemporary puppeteers, not dead puppeteers, but contemporary puppeteers who knock me out, who are doing amazing things, just to say to that community, hey guys, look what this person's doing in this country with that same material, without saying, hey, look, guys, just putting it out there and hoping, you're an educator, Pete. I have taught and mentored, but I don't call myself a teacher, but I have been in that position. Sure. And I realize there are a few things that I cannot teach. And two of them are curiosity and discipline. I cannot make you curious for beyond what you're curious about. I can maybe throw something beautiful in front of you and let you think you discovered it. And that's the reward. And that's what I do with posting those puppet pictures. And like I said earlier, the Russians were doing live hands. Bill Baird was doing live hands. The Russians were using carved foam long before Bonnie picked up foam and carved it. Bonnie just in the shop was the first person in that shop who carved foam that way, and she was a costumer. So she didn't know the history of puppetry either. I wish that in this current cycle of everything starting to look kind of the same, there was a curiosity for the past where a young artist or a working puppeteer might see something from the past and go, oh, this was Russia in 1952 and they did this, and tweak their design sense. So that's really my commentary. People who work in television make so much freaking money. I just wish they would, I wish they would spend some of that money buying the books and looking at something other than what they do, But it certainly is a competitive field now. And there's a lot of stuff being shot. There's a lot of stuff. I mean, there's things being shot in Canada right now. Big series. Yeah. I will say in my community, probably my dearest friends, because I was in television puppetry for so long, but my dearest friends in puppetry are television puppeteers. My two living mentors are Noreen Young and Bonnie Erickson, who were Muppets and CBC television. They were television puppet builders. And, my friend Frank Meshkalite and Andy Hayward and Greg Ballora in LA. So my dearest circle of puppet buddies are those puppeteers. I love them and I love the work they do. Do we need a renaissance of the marionette? Do we need other kinds of puppetry? There's so much interesting stuff going on around the world. I think we just focus on North America and what's happening there, when in fact in England and Iran and Germany, there's sexy puppetry going on, man. Oh, damn. Come on. Mm-hmm. Such, and your plan before COVID was to go to Europe and dive into all of that Hungarian and Czech and Russian stuff. So what I'm talking about. So I don't worry that I can't force anyone to do a marionette show anyway, but, and it works for me, Pete, because I'm a theater artist and I'm a playwright, and I usually tell very dark stories, even though they're funny and dirty. Beautiful. But it's grown-ups only. I'm not for television. I'm a theater guy for adults. So, I don't want to say to these Muppet obsessed young puppeteers, you should do what I do, because most puppeteers aren't very good actors, frankly, and theater puppetry needs really good acting. I mean, we can all sing songs about broccoli and friendship, but that's why I quit television puppetry. I could only sing so many freaking songs about broccoli and friendship. It was like, I can't anymore. But people love doing that. I just don't. I'd rather tell a story about the Holocaust or a guy's dead dog. Because I'm such a fun guy.
Hypothetical though, like there was a time where Thunderbirds, other great shows that had marionettes in the 60s, mostly when television was still new. Hansen was at this time inventing Kermit and, patenting him. But there was series that, that used marionettes on camera. And say a studio was to come to you and say, we want to do a marionette show for TV. We want to bring that back, which I think with the stop motion doing what it's doing now, and with there is a kind of a renaissance, a kind of a hark back to the old styles of creating. What am I trying to say? The mechanical.
I know what
kind
you're
of
trying
stuff.
to say. The sort of retro vibe of that stuff. And I've had those calls from producers over the last decade. And I had one producer who said to me, anything you want to do. And I said, yeah, well, that would be marionettes. And she said, that's why we're having this meeting. And, I came up with a concept. But honestly, Pete, I know this is going to sound insane to your listeners who just want to work on a TV series, but I'm telling you, I backed away because I thought, I got to smell an audience. I'm a road guy. I like going to work at 4 p.m. and curtain up at 8. And that's my life. And I'm in the third act of this career. I don't want to do that because it wouldn't be the most authentic, loving, joyful part of me. And that's all I have to give right now to the craft is I got this far. Please let me tell you these stories now. I will not live long enough to tell all the stories and experiment with all the things I want to do. So I've actually said no to those producers who've come to me and said, let's do this retro thing because somebody will. And there's a new sort of spin-off of the Super Marionation thing happening in England right now. I follow them on Instagram, Century 21, I think they're called, or something. And they're doing new episodes. And so that's already happening. And it's got all that camp sort of retro look to it. So huzzah and hurrah for them. It is happening. I think a lot of puppetry is now derivative of a television style that was invented for television. It's funny, it grew through, in North America, certainly, the Christian puppetry movement were the first to really glom onto that style of puppetry. And, that is an entire world of people that I'm connected with a few of them, but they're like a separate entity in puppetry that unless you're part of it, you don't really connect to it, but it's all that style. All of it.
Well, it is. And on the flip side, that's kind of how puppetry really entered schools, I feel, because it was, your scripture classes would come into the school and do, half-hour puppet show. The funny thing is, by virtue of it being from a religious point of view, when public schools kind of said, we can't have any of that, we can't have any, of that sort of, political and or religious bias in a classroom, that's the moment that all that great stuff that was in our classrooms left. And so what I found in a lot of the schools I've been working in, these really old, beautiful puppet kits that have just been left there with these Genesian scripts. And, it's interesting. How do we reinvigorate that in a classroom if these guys did it so well by using the Bible as their text to base everything off? And what is the next text to get us into kids' classrooms again? It's a really interesting thing.
I will say this about a lot of television puppeteers I know, there seems to be a great curiosity right now for, the British term, and Americans, for some odd reason, are using the British term, not the American term, glove puppetry. And because I straddle both from our earlier chat about the library being half American and half British, and I was taught by an American named Martin Stevens who called it a hand puppet, for God's sake, so I'm calling it a hand puppet. But a lot of television puppeteers are enamored and curious with glove puppetry. And that's exciting. And because of our mutual hero, Richard Bradshaw, who's been all over the world and been to America a lot. Yeah. Shadow puppetry is exploding, certainly during the last year, because it's more camera friendly for stuff at home during COVID. And we've seen a lot of shadow puppetry. So I don't despair that any of the other isms of puppetry or forms of puppetry will disappear, because each has their own innate, beautiful charm. And I think the marionette scares people. But as you mentioned, Bernd Agrognik, is such a good teacher. And such a generous teacher and such a great artist and such a wonderful man. So, I can't do that. That's not my wheelhouse to do it. I'm so grateful that Bernd Agrognik is doing that. And I know so many young American puppeteers who are carving now because they have been carving with Bernd. And he gave us that. So nothing is going to disappear. Nothing is going to disappear ever, ever.
I'm really interested in, you just mentioned that you're in the third act of your career in this business, and
who does a 3-act anymore? Come on.
Oh, this is probably a 1-act show right here. But anyway, he points to himself. I'm interested in reflecting back on your shows. Which is your favorite, and do you have a favorite character? That's probably been asked of you a million times. I'm sorry, but I'm really curious as to you've done so many. I know what my favorite is, but I've only seen so many. So. What do you think?
They're all different experiences, Pete. So, I love the ones I'm doing right now. I think overall, just to be easy, I love the Daisy because, the holy trinity of Schnitzel, Edna Rural, and Esme Mazengill.
Right.
If you get a signature character in puppetry, it's the greatest gift ever. I got 3. I got those 3 characters that are equal thirds me. So they're not on television, so they'll never be wildly famous. But, there are people who will literally see the Daisy Theater 11 times because they love Schnitzel or they want to hear what Edna's going to go off on that night. So I would say that's the easy answer. But, Tinka's New Dress gave me the world. That was the show that gave me an international career. And, it was the first show I brought to Melbourne. And Tinka's New Dress retired in Melbourne. Our last performance ever of Tinka's New Dress was at the Arts Centre in Melbourne. And that was the final show. It was intended to retire there. 10 Days on Earth, I love because I think it made me a better actor because I was playing an intellectually challenged adult male as the central character through a puppet.
Yeah.
And not that I had to take that seriously because he was adorable and funny and sad and all the things a character should be. But I think I approached that character and that manipulation just a little differently than I'd ever touched a puppet before in front of an audience. And so for me, when you add a weight to a character like that, another favorite character in Forget Me Not, which you've seen, Nutso, that little hand puppet of Nutso, kills me because not only did I sculpt him and think, okay, stop, this is enough information. Stop. This is almost a perfect puppet sculpt, Ronnie. And I never say that, Pete. Just leave it alone. Make the mold. Go. That's the puppet. And Nutso for me is a magical puppet, and the fact that in the show he dies and then we have a funeral procession for him and the entire audience trails behind his casket. I mean, that's just, Pete, how weird is that? I make this adorable character, then I kill him in a funny thing where he hangs himself on a tightrope. And then there's a funeral procession and 100 people are wandering with their hand puppets behind him with their heads bowed. I mean, how did that happen? It's a puppet show.
Well, that show though, let's talk about that show because what you had in that show was devices that controlled the audience's experience, and you used command terms. You used Others Rise. You used Like Me. You used these really, really clever ways of directing your audience to go to these places with you. See, that for me is what made that show flawless. Because I never thought that you could manipulate your audience in a way that it was basically like a classroom, but immersed in a story. I want to know where you got that idea.
Because I had gone to shows in Toronto that proposed they were immersive theater. They were environmental theater. They were not immersive. So I remember sitting in very awkward spaces watching really boring plays basically, but I was sitting on the floor or, covered in motor oil or whatever. And I was like, well, this isn't immersive. This is just shite in a garage, really. So I thought there was a lot of talk about immersive theater. The theater loves to crawl up its own ass and have words. I mean, the word right now is everyone's an intersectional artist. It's like, whatever. I don't even know. Whatever, whatever. Just what's your show about is all I'm interested in. But I'd gone to some of these things and I went, no, that's not immersive theater. Immersive theater would mean you need me there to make the show. You need me to light it with a flashlight or put the records on or carry that puppet casket and so that's where that all came from. And I thought, what am I doing? I am a hermit. Why do I want to be this close to the audience? Well, it's because that love affair started 5-7 years ago. I mean, I had to fight with John, the composer, and my stage manager when I proposed, we're going to press each music cue that we've recorded that John composed onto vinyl. And the audience is going to put the record on a turntable and put the stylus on the record. The audience is making that cue happen. And they were like, no. And I held my ground. And same with the 100 hand puppets beat that you all got. Crystal was like, they're going to steal them. People are going to steal the puppet. And I'm like, no, they're not. No, they're not going to steal the puppet. Because... well, you've seen me there, Pete. You've seen me in whatever body I have at that age, sweating like a madman. I'm not out there. I'm telling a complete invention. It's artifice. It's a made up play. But in my own way, it is Ronnie saying to you, I'm telling you my truth and I need you. Please be my community. Yeah. In a world where we've lost a sense of community and civility, I think, to walk into a room and have this bizarre foreigner say to you, I need you to tell this story. And like when I wrote Puppeteers as a child, I am willful enough to make it happen. You will not say no to me. I did see a few people every night kind of sneak out quietly, and it wasn't out of outrage. It was, that's a lot to ask from an audience. It's not everyone's cup of tea. Yeah. And I knew that going in, especially if you'd seen the Daisy Theater beforehand, and I knew that. I said to my agent, my agent didn't get why I wanted to do Forget Me Not. And he didn't resist. He never resists. He just was like asking these ponderous questions over and over for a year. And I had a chat with him and I said, look, the Daisy Theater is our pret-a-porter. It's our ready-to-wear line. Anyone can have it. Anyone can try it on. It's a great date night. We keep the pricing populist. Anyone can come back 3 times. It's sportswear, right? And I said, Forget Me Not is our couture line. It's not for everyone, and only 100 a night can have it, and it won't fit everyone, but it's our couture line. And the minute I said that to him, he went, got it. Yep. Because he needed to know how to sell this stuff, It's not for everyone, but surprisingly, it's for more people than I thought it was, because I had made the mistake of thinking what the audience was. And, we did it in the basement of a decommissioned jail in Vancouver in Skid Row. And you didn't get to know where the venue was until a few days before the show, and you got a secret map. And it was a dodgy area to go to. Most people in Vancouver do not go down to the east end of Vancouver. It's very challenged, with its social issues that are on the street. And so to ask a fancy theater audience to go there and then go into a building and go into the basement and then do this with me, well, they did, because people are better than I give them credit for a lot of times. The audience is ready for a ride,
Oh, certainly. I think, the moment you bought that ticket, you're on board most of the time. I asked this question of Drew Wilson once, and I got a really amazing response. So I'm going to ask you the same question, and that is, what is your favorite kind of story? Oh,
I think I do have an answer for that, Pete.
All right.
I think I do. My favorite kind of story for me to tell, you mean?
Sure.
Sure, is one that I've made up. But as I'm writing, and I've said this when I've, quote, taught, end quote, when you've made up a fantastic story, Take His New Dress or whatever, Forget Me Not, this old crone who writes love letters. This is the premise. We're going with this. And we have a great title, Little Willie. I want to see that show. You know what I mean? When I'm writing, what I didn't tell you, Pete, and so here I'm giving you some writer's advice. I always have right beside me a huge, it's not a real thing, but it's a huge, in my mind, cauldron with coals under it. And it is a cauldron full of bullshit. And what you do is you take a ladle of bullshit into your story and just pour it in there. And then you can tell one true thing about yourself. And then you put in some more bullshit from the cauldron. And then you can tell one more little thing that might have happened to you as a child or when somebody rejected you. But the audience can never think this is autobiographical. And they can never think this is completely made up. The audience has to be a little confused because it needs to feel authentic. It needs to feel authentic from two sources. And this is what I've learned. And this is a mystical thing about puppetry. So slight 2-line deviation. I have spent the last year rethinking what I think about puppetry because I've been forced to sit in this room. And I have actually reread about 800 of these books some of which I used to throw across the room, especially the academic ones, because I actually threw one academic book across the room so violently once. I mistreated a puppet book. But, I reread it this year and I went, okay, I see your point now, But I think what has to happen in puppet theater is there has to be a whiff of authenticity from the performer, and there has to be absolute authenticity from the puppet character.
Yeah, okay.
But we have to know when to get the puppeteer performer out of the way so it's not a solo show that they could do without the damn puppet, because there's a lot of those shows. The puppet is the god. That is the sole reason I'm in this craft, is to give life and authenticity to that thing. But its story might have some of my childhood backstory of abuse and horrible things that happen, or I might have made that up. It's not for the audience to worry about that. It just has to reek of authenticity. And sometimes the cauldron of bullshit smells truer than a true story.
Wow.
Those are my favorite stories to tell. Those are my absolute favorite stories to tell, where I am actually standing out on stage knowing exactly what is Ronnie's backstory and exactly what is made up.
Flip that for me then. What is your favorite story to read or see performed?
The most humble, joyful, folksy hand puppet show is what delights me more than anything on the planet. I have begged every young puppeteer that I've known and worked with to please do a little booth hand puppet show to start. And I will sit on the floor and clap with glee over little mitten puppets on your hands being ridiculous and romantic. And, is there anything greater than seeing glove puppets or hand puppets doing a romantic, serious scene because of their little tiny arms and their impossible mitten bodies? But when a great puppeteer imbues those figures with that earnestness, you believe they are the most beautiful, wistful characters on the planet. That is for me. If you do a hand puppet show for me, I'm yours. I love that the most of anything, and it doesn't matter what it is. It can be Shakespeare, it can be a folktale, it can be nonsense you've made up on the spot. That for me is the greatest thing.
I think you're going to find a lot of people rushing to get some hand puppets happening.
No, they won't. They won't. Unfortunately, every everybody I've worked with, even every assistant who's come out of here, and 3 of them have done major shows. They've never done a small hand puppet show in someone's living room. They've never lugged it to a shopping mall and said, no, everybody has to be Ronnie Burkett out of the gate. And I'm like, Ronnie Burkett wasn't Ronnie Burkett out of the gate. I toured schools for 8 years. I did this for 12 years. I trust me, I didn't have a dressing room with a bathroom until I was in my 40s. So, and so what I'm seeing in puppetry is, aside from the Muppet question you asked, is people starting too big to be serious artists out of the gate, when in fact, I think they're missing the point of puppetry, which is what I told you I'm trying to get back to, is that it's a joyful, beautiful, rustic thing, but if you just set out to be a great artist of puppetry, doing a major theater show, and you'll work less, you're going to work a lot less. If you have a small show that can go anywhere, you'll work all the time. All the time, baby. I had a backstage show that was a suitcase and a thing my mother sewed for the stage that I threw over my shoulder. I flew on little bush planes to go to the Arctic in that. I went to the Golan Heights with that show. I put it on Greyhound buses. Like, if you can pick it up and go set it up and do a show, that's showbiz, baby. You don't need a freaking truck full of stuff on your first go, because most people don't do a second show when they start that big, I found.
Well, that leads me to think, and it feels cruel because I know that you can't, but you travel so much of the year, and you've gone to these places, like little places like that. Just, that's where I want to visit next, because no one else gets to go and do that. And particularly not perform a puppet show to a completely, new audience, new culture, new people. Where do you want to go next?
You mean geographically?
Sure. Yeah, I think so.
Or okay.
Oh, let's go that, and then let's go. Where do we want to take Ronnie?
Yeah, okay. Because see, I'm thinking with you here, Pete. It was interesting that when I got home last March, I was supposed to be home for a while. We had finished a month-long run in February in Vancouver, Forget-Me-Not, and we were supposed to be home. And so lockdown happened, and I thought, yay, I would be in my pajamas for 6 weeks anyway. This is fantastic, and then I'll get on a plane and leave, which is what I'm really good at. And where I was leaving to next was to go to Germany. And Europe had kind of disappeared for me. We had some weird government policies with our conservative previous government who killed touring abroad. And then, Europe got kind of xenophobic in a way and weren't bringing in a lot of international. Anyway, it just all changed. And I watched my beloved European career just kind of disappear. So the opportunity to go to this festival in Germany in May was so exciting to me because they wanted Forget-Me-Not. And to do Forget-Me-Not with a German audience, I thought, oh my God, this is going to be fantastic, because German audiences are so, intense. And it's an intense show, right? Yeah. So I couldn't wait. And I thought maybe this will open up Europe again. So I would like to go back to Europe. And also, the most exciting puppeteers that I follow on Instagram happen to be over there. Where do I want to go? I should have moved to Australia 30 years ago when I first went there. I said at the time, I should just move here. I should be single and move here. I should have just made myself single and moved to Australia, because it's my heart home, because it is so much like Canada, except without the parkas and the winters. You're sexy Canadians. Like,
that's interesting. I find Canadians very sexy.
And Melbourne, I loved Melbourne. I just want to stay on the road, Pete. I really do. And America had started opening up again. I avoided America for a long time. And I will say this about an American audience: when they love something and they have a sense of discovery in the theater, that they're seeing something they didn't know about before, their enthusiasm is unmatched in the world. It is unmatched, So I'm a road dog. This was, Martin Stevens said to me when I was a child, or 12 years old, he said, you do know, Ronnie, if you want this, you're going to be on the road for 40 years. And it's been over 40 years, and it's still okay for me. He was trying to talk me out of it in a weird way. I happen to love hotel rooms and eating at 11 o'clock at night and I love it. I mean, I can't imagine being on an airplane right now or a hotel right now, quite frankly. So I have to retrain myself when I'm able to go do that. But I just want the world. And I think that's why my parents put me on those planes when I was a child, because my mother was a little afraid of the world, but fascinated by it. My father had missed a few opportunities to be at the Australian Olympics, for example, on the Canadian team. Wow. And he had lost a few opportunities to be in the world. So every time I went into the world, he was so happy. He wanted the stories of what the world was like. So I was raised to be curious for the world, not afraid of the world. And those puppet books only reinforce that, to see Czech puppetry and German puppetry and British puppetry. I couldn't wait to get out there. And so, anyone who's ever been on my crew, Pete, will invariably say to me, how do you have best friends in every city we go to? And I'll say, because puppetry,
that's it.
I'm Switzerland. But I mean, you were part of the group in Sydney. You guys came out en masse as a group.
We did.
And then we met afterwards. And that happens everywhere to me. And I feel this great affection all over the world because of puppetry and because I'm a moving target. And during the Sydney run of Forget Me Not, because we didn't get to Melbourne, I had 4 friends on separate visits come from Melbourne, like flew to Sydney.
Oh, we will
see the shows.
Yeah.
So that is my experience in the world. So for me, the world is, I mean, I love this home. I love where I'm at. I love my home and my life, but my home is also out there doing that. And I can't imagine that stopping. I hope it's not stopped.
I think that's the definition for me of puppet power, #, because that's why we do it. Like, I just feel like this is the community that we're a part of, and that is what puppetry power is. So, is Ronnie Burkett a 5-act play? What does Ronnie want to do?
Well, it's going to be the longest 3rd act you've ever seen. Years ago, I had, I go through a lot of stage managers. Crystal, who you've met, my stage manager now, has been with me like 10 years plus. And I'm keeping her. She's never retiring. And I think we've made that blood pact. But, before Crystal, a lot of stage managers would last on the average 2 years. And then they would go, oh, it's actually not a vacation. Because touring is not a holiday. And if you go on tour thinking, I'm going to all the museums during the day and I'm going to have lunch with people during the, I don't do any of that on tour. I'm on tour to do a show. So when people realize they're not on holiday, it's actually a job in a really great city. And they think, maybe I just want to have a real life back in Canada. But I had a very earnest young stage manager, and we had hired her at quite a young age, thinking we're going to really train her for a long haul in the company, and she'll stay with us a long time. Well, she didn't. She stayed shorter than anyone because she realized she wanted to get married and have babies. And you can't argue with that. It's like, you should go have your best life. So on her last day, I said, well, I hope you find the life that you want. And when you have those children, when they're 16, you can bring them to Uncle Ronnie's puppet show when they're old enough to come to an adults only show. And she very earnestly, Pete, put her hand on my arm and looked at me with all the earnestness of a 24-year-old. And she said, oh, Ronnie, by the time my children are 16, you'll be far too old to be doing this with all this scenery and all these puppets and all that text and singing. And I looked at her and I said, you know what? No. And I said, you're right. Because by the time I'm that age, I hope I figured out how to stand on a bare stage with 3 puppets and tell you the most glorious story you've ever heard. I took it as a challenge. So, I have friends who've promised to smother me with a pillow when I'm wearing Crocs, a fanny pack, and have a ponytail. That's the end of my career. So you can actually just kill me when I turn into that guy. Cool. But I would like to just keep telling stories with puppets because, you know what, Pete? I haven't figured it out. This is going to sound silly. I honestly feel like I'm just starting. I really do. And now that I'm relooking at hand puppets, I'm like, all right, what are we going to do with that form? I've got some ideas of what I'm going to do with hand puppets that haven't been done before. So I'm just starting on that road. I don't ever feel finished. It's like, what's next? What's the next? And then there's the curse of, my biggest curse, Pete, is I go to bed with an idea every night.
You don't sleep.
And I wake. No, and I wake up with that idea. And it is kind of a curse because I basically sleep 3 hours a night. But I have my whole life gone to bed with an idea. Some of them are stupid, but some of them have been pretty good. And I wonder what it would be like to go to bed without an idea, and if that day comes and lasts more than a day, maybe that's when it's done. But until then, I got ideas, right? And now that I've reread 800 puppet books this year, I got all kinds of new ideas. I think I was wrong about half of it, So
gosh.
let's try the new stuff.
We just want you to keep going, Ronnie. That's what we want, that's for sure. And so, I'm torn. I want to ask you what you think. Normally, this is the part of the show where I'd ask people what they think the state of puppetry is in this country, in Australia, but also over the world, and whether or not it's thriving or whether or not it needs something to keep going or to keep reinventing itself. What do you think puppetry needs? I'm just going to ask that question.
Well, I've listened to all of your interviews, and I've listened to, and because I've been privy to being treated with such affection and kindness every time I've come to your country, I feel like I know the community well, actually. And I've heard the discussions about training, and this is a discussion across the board of training. What do you do? And I know your own personal journey that was stopped, Pete, was about continuing your training in a really focused way outside of Australia. This might be more controversial than anything I'm going to say. Unless your parents need you to get a degree, and unless you absolutely need a degree, I've been telling people for the last 3 years, don't go to theater school, and don't go to a theater school to learn puppetry unless you need the degree. Unless that's part of your trajectory and you want to be an academic, or you want teaching in your back pocket or whatever. If 14-year-old Ronnie Burkett, who knows he's just going to be a road pig working puppeteer for hire, and you don't need a degree, tell me how much money you have allotted to your education, and I will help you go to the Little Angel for their course, and then to go to Prague for that course, and then to go here for that course, and then to get an internship somewhere in America where you work for free. It might be in a special effects shop, or wherever. We can look at the whole world and what's available. And in the course of a year or two, if you have that much money, you will not only have all those skills in your hands, you will have met your community. So that's actually my advice to young artists who know for a fact they want to be in the game performing as puppeteers. It's a different story if someone needs the academic world. But I think that's a little controversial because I don't think one place can give you everything you need. I mean, Lumen Code and we have the National Theater School here, and my stepdaughter went to the National Theater School, 3-year program. It's boot camp. We have the National Circus School. And Lumen Code and I, 25 years ago, thought we should, get some funding and do the National Puppetry School with the same model of funding and do it.
That's what I want to do.
And so we were trying to write the syllabus, and we realized we would need a 6-year program to teach everything we thought needed to be taught in a puppetry school before you unleashed them. Not 2 years, not 1 year, not 4 years. 6 solid years. Well, to become an electrician in Toronto, you have to apprentice for 6 years to be an electrician. So why can't we assign the same standards to puppetry? Why is everybody gets to call themselves a puppeteer and nobody goes, prove it. It's just like, that is the most glorious and maddening thing about our community.
It is.
any dork with a pie plate on their hand can walk in and go, I'm a puppeteer. And we all go, yes, you are. And I'm like, some days I want to go, no, you're not. You bought 2 pies and you ate them and you taped them together. But, maybe that is puppetry. Maybe that is, I don't know. I think anyway, to get back to the original point of your question, Pete, I agree with you. Training is always an ongoing question in any country, I think. And I've listened to that it's a concern in Oz of how do you train and how at some point in professional work, it gets competitive, because people are going up for the same jobs or whatever. So how do you have an association of colleagues and peers and also be in a competitive industry? These are ongoing questions, I haven't found that so much because I'm kind of a lone wolf now. I make my own work for me. So it's not like I'm taking work from anyone and I'm not auditioning for stuff that someone else is up for. I remember those days though. And that's when you need training. That's when it's all about technique. It's your manipulation skills and your vocal work and how to work a monitor and how to tape your script onto the monitor, like all of these things that need to be taught and learned and practiced over and over and over and over, because that is the thing about any artistic discipline. It is the repetition of technique that makes you better. It is not about doing it once and then it's done. So you've seen live puppet shows where obviously that company has done that show many times and it's slick and it's oiled and it's sexy because, every breath, every beat is precise. You don't get that on your first outing. You don't ever get that out. And that's where rigorous training and discipline comes into play. I agree with you.
I want to extend that question now to internationally. Where do you see puppetry being? And it's really hard to see it without the COVID lens that's on at the moment. But let's say, take us back to 2018, internationally in Canada, elsewhere, this is Talking Doc International. I want to know what your thoughts are on where is puppetry globally right now? And is it in a good place?
Well, I will say with the COVID lens on, what it did do is it gave me time without deadlines or having to be anywhere to actually engage with some puppeteers around the world that I normally might not have. I might have scrolled by or whatever. And I've seen a lot of what's going on in the world because of this past year, and the stuff that's really exciting out there. That's a really good question, Pete. I don't know if I'm such an authority to know really, but it felt like puppetry in the legitimate theater was no longer that big a deal. I mean, in a good way, that it wasn't like, oh my God, there's puppets in this show. In Melbourne, you've seen it with the opera, all of that stuff everywhere. And so my concern is if the theater is like restarting again, are puppets going to have to like knock on the stage door again and go, hey, remember us? Or did we already get our foot there firmly? And I think we did, I do think we did. There's everything but the thing I want to see. It got really big, right? There's Lion King, Your Magnificent Kong that came from Melbourne, War Horse, of course, Handspring's incredible work. Mm-hmm. I personally hope that what this shuttering has done and the reemergence of the theater is we get to see small puppetry again. Really intimate, beautiful puppetry with hidden puppeteers in a booth. We don't have to see your face. We really don't need to see everybody's faces in puppetry all the time, my own included, So I would like us to regroup, get small. And small does not mean lack of experimental or sexy or dark or small shadows, small rod puppets. I'm just talking about really letting the puppeteer take full responsibility for the show again, and not these massive things that seem a bit detached from puppetry to my mind.
I see what you mean. All right, Ronnie, last question. And, you've already mentioned... Last question. You've already mentioned a lot of them, but who are perhaps your contemporary heroes in puppetry? And who would you like to thank for your career? What are the names that we should know?
All right, let's talk about contemporary first, and she is contemporary. This is random, so there's no
hierarchical
order on the list. Yeah, none at all. But I thought of her today, of Lindy Wright at the Little Angel Theatre, who I think influenced an entire generation of British puppet designers with her stylized, simplistic, gorgeous puppet designs. True hero, and was very kind to me personally. Mechtilde Nienaber, whose name I might have mispronounced, in Germany, who does things with fabric in basically a hand and rod style, but creates sewn puppets she's the perfect marriage of an artist, designer, and a technician. And to see those two come together, it's fantastic. Rolf Hansen in Denmark, I think, is our most playful and experimental puppeteer that I see working today. We've mentioned Bernard Grognik and his work. There's a fellow whose work I only really got to know in the past year, and it's only online, is Peter O'Rourke from Cubic Feet Theatre in the UK, which knocks me out. I swear, anything he posts, my jaw drops, and I'm like, I have to share that imagery. And recently, there's something going on in Iran. I've clicked into all of these puppeteers in Tehran, and there's one, and I'm going to not say her name properly, Monir Molevedela, I think it is, Monir, who is doing things with carved foam rubber that is, I send it to every Muppet obsessed builder I know. It's like, look at this. This is foam rubber. Look what's happening here. There's Duda Paiva in the Netherlands. Stunning work. And of course,
gorgeous.
The goddess to me, because I just don't understand the work, and that's why I love it. It's the kind of work that I look at and I think, I don't understand why I love this so much. And you scare me, is of course Ilka Schönbein, who I think is the greatest living puppet artist we have today. So, and there are so many others. There are so many good puppeteers out there, but those are the ones top of my head that I would say: Mechtilde, Monir, Rolf, Peter O'Rourke, Ilka, and Duda. It's healthy out there. I mean, it's very healthy, and none of those people are building Muppets. So I think the art form is, to answer your question, I think we're just fine. Go ahead and Muppet clone children, because there's the other thing is happening too. And I think each in our own way, we appreciate everything everybody's doing. I really do. I will say this, we do. Pete, I think this year has taught me that we are all struggling. We are all desperate to be relevant, to be seen, to not be forgotten, and to be puppeteers. That is, for me personally, a lifelong dream worth living. To say I'm a puppeteer is the greatest thing in my life. And that's all I ever wanted to be able to say about myself before all the other isms about who I am came into play. And I see that. An online activity is our community, whether they're working in wood or foam or fleece or dancing nude with a puppet or doing a mall show or doing a shadow puppet. It doesn't matter. I see the community saying, I want to be a puppeteer. And I think, for any flippant thing I might have said in our interview, I'm reminded this year that I need to have the spirit of generosity that I have always been met with, especially in these times, especially in our community, because people need to know they have an artistic community to be part of in a lonely profession.
That's absolutely it. So who helped you become a puppeteer? I mean, you've mentioned them before, but who would you like to thank for making you a puppeteer?
I would say Noreen Young and Martin Stevens primarily. Oddly enough, though, my real heroes were not puppeteers. They were people who saw a young puppet boy and said, you go, So I would say my high school drama teacher, my high school art teacher, my singing teacher when I was a teenager, my tap dance teacher when I was a teenager, the librarian in Medicine Hat, Mr. Robert Block, the children's librarian in Medicine Hat, Alberta, who put books aside for me And for my parents who didn't understand this at all, but had an amazing capacity to not say, they never said, yes, you should go be a puppeteer. We've signed you up for all these courses, like a lot of modern parents do. My parents actually beautifully never said no. They're just like, all right, whatever. But I think those are my heroes, the people in my day-to-day life who saw this interest and who didn't understand the craft or what I wanted to do with it, but just said, go. Do you know, this is a great story, Pete. In high school, I had aligned my afternoons so that I had drama and art class back to back.
Hey.
And my drama teacher and my art teacher invariably, if I had a gig, would mark me present in school when I was out on the road, because they both felt I was learning far more about drama and art by going and making that $50 gig in some school gymnasium 100 miles away. So they marked me present in class. That was the kind of support those heroes gave me. And yes, there were many puppeteers along the line. And, I will say this, a lot of my heroes and mentors were very disappointing because I hadn't planned on them being human beings. And what do you think happened? I showed up and they were human. Well, not even that. I understand it now. I'm sure I've been quite disappointing to a lot of people because, I'm a human being and I'm incredibly flawed and opinionated and cranky sometimes. But it was interesting to meet them all. And I think the fact that any of them opened their door to me, anybody who let me in the studio or their home, that's a hero. That's a real hero.
Rock on.
That's what I try and do in Puppetland. I may not have the answers, but I have the books and I'll make you dinner. So that's as good as I can give back, I think.
Oh, Ronnie, I'm coming to Puppetland. That's going to happen.
You certainly are.
I'm going to invite myself in there just like you did. Well, we are out of time, Ronnie. Thank you so much for talking sock with us today. Thank you. You can find Ronnie at Ronnie Burkett, and Ronnie is represented by John Lambert and Associates. You can also find Ronnie on Weeper, the World Encyclopedia of Puppetry Arts. Thank you for listening with us today, and make sure you subscribe for more great puppetry arts and practitioner interviews. I've been Pete Davidson, that puppet guy, and we will talk sock again soon. Thank you, Ronnie.
Thanks, Pete.
And we're done.
Thanks for listening. Now we want to hear from you. Each week, we'll post a series of questions related to every interview. Join the conversation on Twitter at TalkingSockcast. You can help us bring puppet power to the podcasting world by hitting subscribe, liking our socials, and telling your friends. Like us on Instagram at OneOrangeSockProductions and check out our episode blog at oneorangesock.com. You can support our podcast by pledging to us on Patreon. Your support helps fund our audio mastering, interview transcriptions, and much, much more. Find the link in the podcast notes and earn yourself a shout out on our socials. Head to our website at oneorangesock.com or talk to us on Twitter to see how you can show your support. Our music is composed by Elizabeth Maniscalco and our cover art is by Chad Barnier. Without them, this podcast wouldn't be possible. Stay tuned. We'll be back soon with another great episode of Talking Sock.